Hi, my name is Winston Linquister, and I'm a current undergraduate at Duke University. So, to those who may be wondering, the purpose of this podcast is to both fight stigma surrounding mental disability, as well as give a face or voice to those involved in disability studies, a field of study that is quite often unnoticed or unknown to many. Now, mind you, I don't have any real experience with video or audio editing, and this entire podcast is basically amateur. However, I hope either way, these conversations can give to our audience a better understanding of disability studies and those involved in it. So, thanks. I hope you enjoy and have a great Disability Pride Week.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's episode of the Mad Studies podcast for Disability Pride Week, your podcast for breaking down stigma and bringing the voices of disability studies right to you. I'm your host, Winston Linquister. Today, our guest is Douglas Kidd, an advocacy-oriented professional with work ranging from a qualified health home specialist to a supporting care manager. Douglas works to reduce stigma for traumatic brain injury survivors and is himself an amnesia and coma survivor with numerous papers and publications in tow. So with that, let's get started. Thank you, Douglas, for agreeing to come on our podcast. How are you doing today?
You're welcome, Winston. I'm excellent. Thank you very much.
Great, great. So let's just get started with this. So Douglas, for our audience who may not be familiar with you or your work, do you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Not at all. Please, thank you. So, May 17, 2005, I was on my way to a round of golf at the western end of Lake Erie, and I was talking on my cell phone, and I failed to yield at an intersection. Then an SUV going approximately 45 miles an hour and weighing about 3.5 tons slammed into the driver's side of my car. I don't remember any of the next 2.5 months. Um, and I'm, yes, so I was completely unconscious. I was in a coma for almost a month, then states of amnesia for 6 to 7 weeks to follow, then gradually came return to myself. I think of it like a shaking something violently, and it takes a long time for elements to settle and make their ways, well, realign.
Okay. Um, so how is the recovery process from that?
Well, it's an ongoing process of recovery. I mean, every moment of our lives, we process our surroundings, interact with people, situations. So, and while I'm almost 12 years removed from the accident, it still affects the emotion centers of my brain primarily. So sometimes well, I, I sometimes often have emotional collapses that I can't control. It's really difficult to describe, but the mechanism of my brain acquired damage. Somehow enough brain cells realigned and I emerged, but it's like riding a whirlwind. I don't always know. I mean, most times when I'm with people, I can pass. It doesn't mean, I mean, we all have emotional highs and lows. I've learned to conceal mine fairly well when I can be in a room crying and no one would know but me, or those that really knew me that could see that I was upset.
So, um, basically, how have you coped with that degree of adversity, that sorry, difficulty with basically the damage that affected your emotional centers of your brain? How have you coped with it?
Well, it's interesting, and because at the same time is my innate ability to survive and recover and return to how I used to be. So I don't dwell on it. I mean, I acknowledge these emotional collapses when they occur, but I move on. And overall, I will say that I'm happy. I mean, it's kind of modulates between euphoria and depression and all the states in between. It can happen at any moment, but my innate ability to survive prevails. I mean, I just go about my life one day after another, try to be happy. Um, so yes, it's an ongoing. It's not really a struggle because often they're just a stream of days where nothing happens, where I'm just living my life, working, just normal interaction. Um, but I would say that there isn't a day that goes by where I don't have an emotional collapse. Typically, I'm alone by myself. Um, Rarely do I feel comfortable enough to be people to break down. But so it's difficult to conceptualize. It's not really a battle. It's just something that I've come to accept that can happen.
Mhm. Thank you so much for sharing this very personal aspect of your life, Doug.
Well,
Um,
you're welcome.
sorry. Uh, have you experienced any stigma from your status as a brain injury survivor?
I certainly have, um, ranging from teenage children seeing me walk down the road, pointing out, "Look at that guy walk." I mean, I understand. I went 18 months without the ability to walk, so to me, I'm so happy, and I'm walking. I can even hike and jog. I mean, I'm kind of funny when you look at me running, but I'm doing it. So I've ranged from, and I understand they were immature teenagers laughing at me. Um, so that's one social response that I've received. But frequently it's commiseration. Frequently people, I was in New York City outside the Metropolitan Museum of Art, walking, moving, excited about the opportunity to enjoy the museum. And a woman stopped me in full flight, said, "Are you okay? Are you in pain?" and and for me conceptually i'm I'm busting with excitement to get to the museum. I didn't even think about how I walk and sometimes lurch. So yes, those are definite responses. And on another trip I flew to England and was ushered into a expedited queue where I didn't the immigration officials saw me laboring and well, not really laboring, just walking. For me, it's just walking. And she ushered me to a line uh, where I didn't have to wait. And when I was there, I was squarely placed in front of about a 65-year-old woman who was in a wheelchair, who was clearly displeased because she had waited there for some months. This is immigration at Heathrow Airport.
Oh,
So
geez.
she was annoyed that the immigration official placed me squarely in front of her. So yes, that's another type of social response that I've received. Yeah.
So, have these experiences played into your advocacy work or inspired you to go into advocacy? Uh, sorry. In one of your emails that you sent to me, you made it very clear that you are a staunch advocate for disability care and disability studies. Um, basically, what's the root of your work within advocacy?
You know, it's not really a conscious decision. Let me go back. At the time, uh, and even during my early recovery, I was non-disabled, despite the fact that I'd spent a month in a coma and 6, 7 weeks of amnesia, couldn't walk for 18 months. I was non-disabled until I became exposed to the University of Toledo's Disability Studies program. And that combination, um, when I became aware of other people's stories and identified, and more than that, was really educated by Dr. Jim Ferris, the Disability Studies Program Director at the University of Toledo. It was really, it led to an altering, complete shift in my identity from non-disabled post-accident to exposure to disability studies, and autoethnography is what I preferred, or pursued, I should say, is the method that I use to process much of the world. In fact, as I think about it right now, it was December 2008, and I had a feeling, an emotional low. It was around the holidays, and it was the first poem that I ever fired off, and it fired off in about 2 or 3 minutes, just a surge of consciousness. So if that time, I directly couple that to my exposure to disability studies as an academic pursuit, and really that is what propelled me forward. The idea that there are people, disabled people, and their stories are important, and more than that. I'm sorry, I'm jumping around. More than that, to see the way society oppresses and works against people with disabilities. And I remember distinctly, until I was exposed to disability studies scholarship, Paul Longmore, Timmy Linton, and Dr. Jim Ferris. Uh, I was really, that's really what, and then Dr. Jim is a good friend, and he exposed me to autoethnography as a way to complete my thesis project. And since that moment, I really haven't looked back. Once I found that the story that I have is valid and people want to hear it, it's helped me so much. Disability studies has helped me to ground my, or help my brain recovery, plus grounds me as an individual.
So, what's the primary area of work that you're looking into with your disability studies, or sorry, your advocacy? Um, Basically, how do you work as an advocate?
Um, how do I work as an advocate? Well, let me go back to in June of 2014. I was hired as a peer support specialist by Harbor, which is a large mental health care provider, and it was one of the few jobs that I know. It's the only job that I know. Well, not the only, but it requires that you have a history, some cognitive or psychological issue to get the job. You have to be disabled to get the job. So that, um, as I work with people, helping them to their appointments, encouraging their attendance at appointments, um, that was really the beginning of my advocacy. I mean, I wasn't really aware of it at the time. I wasn't directly encouraged. Well, it's kind of complicated, but uh, it's determined through research that peer supports lower the barrier to acceptance of treatment. And I don't know all the know that when uh, people relate on a different level to peers. So, and there's that aspect of my professional aspect, and I've moved on to case management where I am no longer a peer. I do use my strengths as a peer, but I now help people to connect to community resources and psychiatric treatment. So the main form of my advocacy is an expression is autoethnography, and um, I went to Norway last year and presented about well, the title of my paper was social implications of surviving severe traumatic brain injury, the lives of two brothers. It's about me and my brother Richard, who on December 31st, 1987, as a pedestrian, was struck by a car. He spent almost a year in a coma, and who knows how long in amnesia, and he's yet to fully recover. So I'm sorry I'm going a long way around. So my advocacy is it helps, well, helps students, and also I lead the Greater Toledo Brain Injury Support Group, which is a social outlet for people with disabilities. Um, well, traumatic brain injury survivors, all brain injury survivors, but um, um, I'm sorry, Winston, I'm kind of
You're fine.
sputtering here, but um, yeah, so, right,
Okay. Thank you so much. So,
you're welcome.
you brought up a few points that I'd like to touch on with what you've described with your advocacy. First and foremost, though, how has the path to recovery been for your brother as well?
You know, when you talk about stigma, Richard has encountered the worst of society's response. He's um, he's gone through absolute horrors from uh, medical mistreatment, miscalculation, uh, because they didn't recognize that. Uh, uh, I'm sorry. Um, um,
Go ahead. Don't
he's
worry about it.
okay. He's encountered. Um, well, number one is neglect from me, and I will say that at the time of my brain injury, I saw Richard. Richard was a well of pity. I wouldn't well of pain. I wouldn't go into easily. I'm sorry, Winston. I'm losing my thread here. So um,
If you don't want to talk about your brother, that's perfectly fine. I will.
no, I'm absolutely comfortable. I'm just so if you could repeat the question again, Winston. I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. I was just wondering how his path to recovery has been.
Um, his past recovery has been, it's really, it's surprising that he's come through as much, surprising that he's still alive given all that he's come through. He experienced additional brain damage because he stopped breathing at the scene for an unknown period of time. So he acquired massive amounts of brain damage. Um, which really limits his ability to interact with people. At one time, he was actively undergoing rehabilitation therapies. He recovered the ability to speak, hold a glass, use a fork, and but being in custodial care and uh, he just more or less dropped out of humanity. I can't say anything. So let me give you an example of an extreme case of social isolation he encountered. He he used to participate in the weekly recreational therapy sessions that they had at a nursing home. Well, when Richard, sometimes when he is engaged in an activity, his voice grows loud, and he was yelling. Evidently, those in the room thought he was become too loud. They removed him from the room, and that was it for his session. So the uh, 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 an aide said that so he might participate to some extent. They placed him just outside the room with the closed door. So there's a case where Richard was trying to engage with others, but was removed from the room because he couldn't modulate his voice. Now, I'm not saying that, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I do know Richard can become loud. But to me, that he was he was fulfilling his end of the bargain. You know, he was engaged, he was recreating.
Oh yeah, and it's really kind of ironic that, and really sad that that occurred at a recovery place that he even received or experienced stigma there.
It
Um,
is.
one phrase that you mentioned that really stuck out to me was dropped out of humanity. What do you mean by that in terms of stigma?
Well, um, people don't, and I've encountered this to some extent, very large, very small degree. Let me give you an example. When I was in uh, active outpatient rehabilitation, a director of, not director, but a physical therapist looked past me to my then fiance and asked her questions about me. So, and I was thinking, wow, I mean, here I am, and then I, I, I forced the physical therapist to engage me. So don't speak with my fiance, speak to me. So when I say dropped out of humanity, people don't even recognize him. They don't care. He's just a, um, he's just a body in a wheelchair or a bed. They don't seek to engage him. They don't seek to ask him questions. How are you doing? Now, I can't. I can't say that's 100% true because I don't spend all my time with him, but I know I've witnessed it where people. Um, Let me give you an example. I think probably the best example that I'm thinking of is I he there was a local minor league baseball team that had a social outing. One night, everyone was invited. Not everyone, but people were invited to enjoy a night out at the ballpark. So Richard came. Um, and he um, he has no ability to initiate conversation. He can respond. He only can respond to questions and stimuli. So when I introduced Richard to an acquaintance at this occasion, uh, the acquaintance had a look on his face that said, "What are you?" looking at Richard, because Richard didn't respond. He didn't. He said, "Hiya, Richard. How are you?" And Richard didn't make any response. Didn't nothing verbal, nothing, no nonverbal, um, and with that, that ended the conversation. So that is for that individual, and Richard wasn't considered human. He was dropped from humanity. I mean, well, yeah.
Sorry, minor technical difficulties due to internet connections. Everybody, sorry about that. Minor technical difficulties. It doesn't look like we can get the video feedback up, but we have the audio and we still have Douglas on the other end. So without further ado, Douglas, continue where we left off. We were talking about how we can overcome stigma as a society.
Yes, and I think conceptualizations of people with traumatic brain injury. Um, I was talking about the classic cartoon image of someone that had been struck by something fell on them. They were seeing stars with the orbiting flare of image. So I think that's an interesting way, but it puts brain injury survivors at a distance and also makes them seem, well, I don't like the word crazy, but it just puts a distance uh, between the person with a brain injury um, and I'm sorry, I'm sputtering. I'm trying to think of what. Um, so I'm sorry, Winston. I think we'll have to start again.
It's okay. It's okay.
I lost the thread. Uh,
So do you want me to repeat the question?
yes, please. Thanks so much.
So, I was just asking, as a society and as individuals, how can we overcome the stigma that's present for those who suffer from traumatic brain injury?
Okay, very good. Thank you for the question. I think one of the big ways and one of my earliest lessons about disability studies is the use of the word suffer. I think, and I know that it is a def, dictionary definition to someone who has suffered is someone that is acquired. It's the event of, well, whatever it might be. You can say, so yes, I did suffer a traumatic brain injury, but I'm no longer suffering. I have, so that is one way to recognize that people with traumatic brain injury are just living their lives. And I think it's really, for me, it made me a better person. It made me more human, more aware of other people. Um, Yes. So um, I don't. I think one way to reduce stigma is to avoid use of the word suffering. I never use it. I used to say to people that I suffered a traumatic brain injury, but then I was exposed to disability studies concepts and the idea that disabled people are suffering is wrong at a fundamental level and and it's inaccurate to say people with traumatic brain injury are suffering. I mean, the acute phase of my injury is long over. I no longer, although I certainly deal with the after effects daily, I'm no longer in pain as a result, other than the emotional it's kind of complicated because my brain can interact as it processes what we as I process my surroundings. I'm deeply affected, as we all are to a certain extent, to input that we receive. We can all be made sad, happy, angry, the whole gamut of emotions. So, but I think it's wrong to conceptualize traumatic brain injuries as suffering. I don't. I no longer use the word. Um,
Okay. Uh, sorry, am I cutting you off?
well, I was just going to say. So I think it's um, um, so people with traumatic brain injury are just living their lives. They're and right, and also, well, I think I already said before that my brain injury made me a better person. It made me more human, made me more empathize, identify with other human beings, which I think is at the core of disability studies is recognizing human limitations, that we're all frail creatures on a diminishing timeline of ability. I mean, granted, humans are, if we're lucky, we'll live, well, who knows, 70, 80, 90 years. But you have to, and that was another aspect of disability studies that kind of, well, I want to say blew my mind, but yes, blew my mind was the idea that we're all on a, we're all on a trajectory, a spectrum, a timeline. Everyone, if you live long enough, you'll become disabled. You'll develop a hearing issue, you develop a visual issue. But I think the idea that I'm not suffering, I certainly deal with emotions as anyone does. We're all subject to our what we process, our surroundings. But I no longer, I'm not suffering. Um,
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that. Um, I'll definitely avoid using that in my vocabulary then, with how I
you're
address
well,
this in the future.
you're welcome.
Um, it's also it's kind of funny that you say that you feel more human now, even though you mentioned that part of the problem with the stigma is that you've dropped out of humanity in a way. It's a very interesting kind of dichotomy with that.
Absolutely.
So, go ahead.
No, I was just agreeing with it.
Oh,
Um,
oh.
and I wasn't saying so much for me. I mean, it's hard for me to argue that I've dropped out of humanity. My ability to speak, to advocate. I mean, I function at a fairly high level. It's people at the other end of the spectrum, like Richard, who have dropped out of humanity, who their humanity isn't recognized, it isn't validated, um, because mainly because the world just goes whizzing past. It moves so quickly that those with traumatic brain, well, those like Richard, and even me to some extent, I still can, if I'm if I'm in an environment where there's a lot going on, my brain, I just can't process things. I don't process the world as I used to.
Hmm.
So for people like Richard, they he's doing the best that he can, but it's not good enough. He doesn't have the ability to keep up with the pace of society.
Okay. Uh, all right. Thank you. So,
You,
sorry, I just lost the thread that I was thinking about for just a second. Oops. All right, we're probably gonna edit this portion out a little bit, but
okay.
from what you were discussing with oh, now I remember. So with that in mind, how is the representation of traumatic brain injury with disability studies itself? At least with my experience and my research into disability studies, I've you generally don't hear about traumatic brain injury so much as diagnosed mental disabilities such as, again, bipolarism, schizophrenia. How is the representation of traumatic brain injury in those circles of academia?
Um, I think it's pretty rare and exceptional actually because even though um, uh, there are more traumatic brain injury survivors, people people like me decades ago didn't survive. I 30 years ago, although Richard survived and he was far more severely injured, I don't want to. I'm sorry, Winston. I'm forgetting. Um, Gee whiz.
It's all right.
So the question is what again? I'm sorry.
So the question was, how is the representation of traumatic brain injury within disability studies and MAD studies?
Um, Boy, that's a difficult question. I think um,
If you, it's fine if you don't have an answer for it. We can look into something else.
yeah, I'm not sure I can answer that question. I do know. Yeah, I can't answer that question, Winston.
That's perfectly fine. So how has your experience been going back to academia? You said that, um, sorry, you said that you've done, well, obviously you've published many papers in your time, and you've also done work at the University of Toledo. How has basically been going to an academic setting with traumatic brain injury in tow?
Well, it was extremely difficult. In fact, I think, and I know through some of the research that they say that a typical outcome or outlook that traumatic brain injury survivors have is being happy. And I was completely happy. I don't know. There's something subconscious where you you think to yourself, the worst that can happen to you has happened, so you're grateful to be alive. And my experience, my exposure to graduate school, especially, um, was extremely difficult. I slipped into depression because I was having difficulty keeping up with the pace of reading. The demands of graduate school itself. Um, um, so I'm not sure if that answers your question, Winston, fully. But
No, it does. It does. Thank you. I'm just asking for your experience with this. So again, thank you for sharing.
yeah, I had more to say about that. But um, so could you repeat the question again, Winston? I'm sorry.
Oh, you're fine. So how has your experience with traumatic brain injury been in the context of your time in academia?
Right, right. Okay. So it was extremely difficult in the beginning until I went to receive accommodations from the Disability Studies Office of Accessibility at the University of Toledo. And then I underwent psychological weekly sessions with a therapist to help me cope with the. I think it's difficult. Graduate school, college is a difficult prospect for everyone, to be certain. But for me, as a traumatic brain injury, it pushed the limits of what I could do. In fact, shortly before I entered graduate school, I went to a collaborative a meeting of psychological and psychiatric professionals, and they suggested that they thought for me with the extensive brain damage that I had, graduate school was no place for me. But I persevered, had understanding instructors, worked extremely hard. Just I look at it like I can describe it like this: an assignment that uh, a reading assignment that would normally take me prior to the injury, say an hour, would take me 4 hours. Multiply that by four. Add to that in the demands of graduate study. So I slipped into depression. Um, didn't undergo any, wasn't on medication, but got through because I was uh, had supportive instructors and had my weekly sessions with the counselor. And then it was mainly just doing the work, writing the papers. Just, I think what's so difficult about living with traumatic brain injury is trying to focus your thoughts on any one particular thing. And that's where graduate school helped me so much to focus to to and then more than that, once I'd accomplished a paper, completed an assignment, to recognize that I'd done it and to give myself credit for that. So it was a slow beginning, um, and it still is. I still can have difficulty processing, but writing is so much easier now. I'm so much more fluent, and thoughts just come. So um, I think that the slippery slope of traumatic brain injury is it's so difficult that for many people just give up. And my advice would be to just stick with it. Just but acknowledge your victories and enjoy life. Um, well, enjoy your accomplishments. Give yourself credit, um, and move on. Keep moving.
Mm-hmm. So, what would you say to any members of our audience listening or watching who, oh, sorry, uh, potentially experienced traumatic brain injury in a manner similar to you, who could be in an academic setting or just going through life? What words of hope or just advice would you give them?
Well, um, I would say to rely on family and friends to to um, help help you through. I mean, the thing about brain injuries is there's they're all different. We're mainly because the the, uh, the damage to brain cells varies so much from individual to individual. Um, so it's extremely difficult to give one catch-all. But for me, I would have been lost without supportive family and friends. So and then I would encourage people to write, journal, talk to others, because it's a way you can. For me, it's been a way for me to move forward. Even now, I'm preparing a paper that I'll deliver in San Francisco in 2 weeks, and the process of writing itself helps you recover, helps me recover, helps. So for those, I would say for those, I would say just accept your victories. Just obviously, it's going to whatever you choose to pursue, whatever is put in front of you. Don't say in the moment it's too difficult. Um, Try it and then stick with it. I think one of the things about every every person on the planet is a survivor. We all have an ability, a drive to improve our lives, to become better at anything. Well, just um, and I would encourage anyone to recognize the challenge that they have in front of them, and then to do the best that they can, and then more than that, to give themselves credit for recognize the ability to it takes courage to swing our legs over the bed each day and get up and go out and cherish life, cherish your opportunities to live. Now, for me, um, uh, I use uh, the support group. Critical to my recovery was the social net that I had in the support group. I would have been lost without uh, the emotional support that I received from family members of survivors and survivors. Um,
Mm-hmm. Uh,
right.
All right, thank you. And as we're kind of winding down towards the end of our podcast, because we're running out of time a little bit, I just have a few closing questions to ask you.
Sure.
Um, First of all, and this kind of ties into the theme of Disability Pride Week this year, is that of accessibility. Um, what work can we do as a society to make the world basically more accessible for those with traumatic brain injury?
Um, Good question. I think there's a big difference between the physical world, um, curb cut barriers, physical barriers that limit uh, people. And I certainly, an outcome of my traumatic brain injury is recognizing that, uh, documenting it, and then acting for change. I serve on the Toledo-Lucas County Disability Toledo-Lucas County Commission with Disabilities. So I saw a problem, and I documented, and then it's still something that I'm working on. But um, and Winston, I'm sorry, I don't want to. I've lost the thread, but that's right. So there's the physical barriers. Um, I'm sorry, Winston, I've lost.
Oh, don't worry about it.
But I do certainly want to talk or tackle the second part of the question. So there's the physical barriers, and then also is the recognition that our survival of the fittest is such a problematic term for society. I don't know really how we can survive. I mean, certainly at an individual level, depending on what you're going to pursue, um, it can it does have demands of the brain. But for what I would say for uh, what society can do, as disability studies scholars first emerged in the early 70s, late 60s, by pointing out the problems with society, primarily the lived world, but also the extreme otherness, fixing fixing disabled people as others, as non-humans. The brilliance of the disability studies movement is to, number one, to validate and recognize that disabled people are human beings with rights. And then specifically, what I would say for traumatic brain injuries like my brother Richard, and to a certain extent myself, is the pace of society is too much. So one, and I know I'm really maybe not, it's hard for society to recognize that they're the culprit, but I think the fast-paced world we live in certainly could be modified to slow down, um, and let the rest of us catch up. I mean,
no, definitely. Um, so finally, are there any final words or messages that you'd like to get out that we never really got to go over? I know we had the break in the middle, which kind of messed with the flow of our podcast. But before we go, I just want to make sure that you have your chance to say your piece with anything that you feel is important that we bring up.
um, I I can't really think of anything other than I'm thinking of a job interview I went on with with a friend. Well, it was a former coworker, and obviously I function at a fairly high level. I can speak fairly fluently, despite the limitations that uh, talk has revealed. But he looked me square in the face and really questioned my mental competence, my ability to just think, to just be. And I think that that right there revealed uh, not it wasn't my problem. It was his perception of me that was the problem, which I think is the strongest argument of disability studies scholarship and activists is to to locate where the problem is. It's not on the disabled people. It's not a question of physical impairment. It's the question of societal expectations. Um,
Mm-hmm. All right. Um, was there anything else you'd like to say, or was that the main gist of it?
um, um, and I appreciate very much, Winston, you giving me time to formulate my responses. I think what what um, I think becoming aware of Irving Goffman's work um, was really pivotal to my understanding of stigma and its effect and its positioning as human beings as other. I think disability studies uh, is the, well provides an excellent avenue forward to bring humanity together, to recognize that yes, you may excel in one aspect, but well, I don't know if there's a humanity quotient. I know there's a intelligence quotient, IQ. I don't know if there's a HQ, a humanity quotient, a measure of how how good a person you are, how receptive you are of others. I mean that I think the, that's one of the best things that disability studies scholars pointed out is that it's not the problem with the individual, it's the society that the individual, with the impaired individual, tries to fit in, tries to keep up with, tries to just exist, to live, to be accepted as a human being.
Mm-hmm. All right, Douglas. Well, thank you so much for all of your insights tonight.
You're most welcome. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Appreciate it.
All right, everybody. That was Douglas E. Kidd. Thanks again, Douglas. And with that, tune in next time, same time, same place, as we continue our Mad Studies coverage of Disability Pride Week.